Hello, I'm Dr. Julie Vogel, and I'm going to get ready to do my presentation. So while I'm getting things set up, if you could all find yourselves A, pen or pencil, something to write with, and B, a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper while I'm getting set up, that would be great. All right, so here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you have your paper and your pencil with you. Again, Dr. Julie Vogel, and today we're going to talk about strategies for effective use of data in the classroom in real time. Just a little bit about me, Dr. Julie Vogel, native of the Midwest, for all my Midwestern folks who are watching out there today, born and raised there, but have lived all over the country. I tend to do things in groups of 10 for some reason, no idea why. 10 years in schools as a classroom teacher, 10 years in higher education, both teaching again and in leadership roles, and 10 years in Catholic school leadership. I am definitely by trade a trained extrovert. It is much easier for me to be an introvert and to stand back, but I've worked very hard to overcome that. And I am a former Catholic school leader, currently living in Houston, Texas. And I'm the vice president for Renaissance Learning in their private and Catholic schools. So I work with leaders all across the country. Before we get started today on content, I would like to take just a minute for all of us to just place ourselves in God's presence and to pray. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. When this is over, may we never again take for granted a handshake with a stranger, conversations with neighbors, a crowded theater, Friday night out, the taste of communion, a routine checkup, the school rush each morning, coffee with a friend, the stadium roaring, each deep breath, a boring Tuesday, life itself. When this ends, may we find that we have become more like the people we wanted to be, we were called to be, we hoped to be. And may we stay that way, better for each other because of the worst. We start all of our presentations at Renaissance with our mission. Our mission is to accelerate learning for all children and adults of all ability levels and ethnic and social backgrounds worldwide. We are committed to learning for all. We are committed to social justice and ensuring that every child and adult has access so that they can become their very best self. So before we get started with content, I asked you to get a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. I want you to take that paper, and the reason I ask you to do this is because taking notes and finding note-taking techniques makes it easier for us to remember things, and it allows us to kind of let some of the details slide by and just get the big picture things. So you're going to take your 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You can fold it in half, however which way you're going to do it, but I'm going to fold it the long way first in half. Then I'm going to fold it over in half again and fold it over one more time in half again. So I have a little tiny rectangle here. Then I'm just going to open it back up and label it with the labels that I have over here on your screen. Hopefully this will help you. If you don't like my labels and you want to figure out what you want to put in your squares, that's totally all right too. This just gives you some method of taking some notes. So let's review a little bit what we're going to cover today. We're going to clarify the audience and purposes of different kinds of assessment. We're going to identify some key components of the student's role in the assessment process. We're going to examine the research on formative assessment, and we're going to examine practical classroom techniques that support student-centered formative assessment. So let's talk a little bit, very briefly, about the definition of assessment. Here it's down as a verb, to estimate or determine the significance, importance, or value of, to evaluate it, and that comes from Webster's dictionary. The Latin root for assess means to sit beside, and it also means as a judge to determine the value of a property. So let's ask ourselves, in the perfect assessment system, who is the assessor and who is the assessee? And forever, what is the property? if we're talking about assessment. Who is the assessor? Who is the assessee? And what is the property that we are assessing the value of? Well, here's my take on that. My take is the assessors are all stakeholders. All right, so if we're talking about all stakeholders, we're going to talk about in our system, bishops, superintendents, and principals. They look at data and assessment things very differently than the second group, the teachers, the students, and the parents. But different people have different purposes for things. So let's take our bishop and our superintendent, for example. They're looking at that very big picture, that 30,000-foot level. They're not looking for little details about every single kid. They're looking about big picture things. How are we doing? How are our kids performing compared to other kids? How are they performing by grade level? How are they performing against kids across the country? We want a big picture snapshot at that level. Principals are somewhere in between. Sometimes they're looking at the 15,000-foot view. How is my school doing compared to other schools? How are we doing grade by grade? And then they might get down to the nitty-gritty. How are teachers doing? How are the kids in their classrooms doing? Are they growing? Are they performing? Are they continuing to move forward? And students are really interested in, how am I doing? Am I getting this? Am I making progress? And parents too. How is my child doing? What are their strengths? How can I help them? What are the things that I can do? So the deal is, assessment depends on the stakeholder, and the results depend on the stakeholder and what their view of it is and what they might want to get out of it. So something to think about. Here's another way to kind of look at it from a research perspective. And if you have an opportunity, I encourage you to download the white paper from Learning Sciences International. And this gives us a broad view of different kinds of assessment in the big picture. There's all different ways to look at it. There's all different things that you can talk about when you're looking at assessment. And on the left side of my screen as I'm looking at it, I don't know if it's on the left of yours, we're going to talk about kind of like the high utility to teachers, students, and parents. What kinds of assessment have value to that group? And then what kinds of assessment have value to high utility or to central office administration? And this is explained more in educational terms. So I think it's kind of interesting to take a look at this research as well. So they talk about short cycle formative assessment. This is monitoring lesson-sized learning targets to adjust our instruction and our teaching right in the middle, in the moment of learning. And I think this is really important. This is that teacher-student relationship and what's going on in that classroom right then and right there. Did I learn what I was supposed to learn today? This is what applies to teachers, students, and parents. Did I learn this today? Is this what I was supposed to learn today? Then there's medium cycle formative assessment, where you monitor learning to adjust instruction across related lessons. Say I'm giving 3 or 4 lessons on fractions, and after that third lesson, I want to know how kids are doing. Did they get this whole concept of adding like fractions? And it took me 3 days to teach it, so I'm going to check right at that point to see how they did on that. That's medium cycle formative assessment. Then there's classroom summative assessment. Believe it or not, summative assessment applies in the classroom. And that's where you check for progress and you check if kids learn something at specific points in time. Maybe it's at the end of my unit on fractions where I've taught them all different kinds of things about fractions in 5th grade, and it's time to see how much they have retained about fractions. So there, the big question that we're answering is, did I retain what I learned? Did I remember all of these different things about fractions over the course of the 3 or 4 weeks that we studied fractions in our classroom? On the other side of this chart, we're going to talk about long cycle formative assessment and district level or summative kinds of assessment. Some of those apply in our Catholic schools and some of them don't. But to be literate in assessment, you at least need to be aware of how those work. And these have a different audience. So these are directed at central office administration. So long cycle formative assessment, we're looking at general outcomes for long-term instructional planning 2 to 3 times a year. What's interesting about this is that I believe that this has appropriate context for interim kinds of assessment, an assessment tool that you might use 2 or 3 times a year to see if kids are moving along and learning the content or learning the skills that go with that particular discipline. Where am I in the progression of learning? It answers that question. In my math skills, am I gaining them? Am I growing them? Am I moving forward and up the learning progression scale? Then there's district level summatives. Sometimes I've seen them as state tests. Sometimes they're one and done assessments that you do at the end of a school year that monitor outcomes at an endpoint or an end of a course if you're doing an AP thing and you take an AP exam, a state summative assessment, a one and done assessment, we call them oftentimes in our field. Those really aren't about me in particular as one person, but they're more about the group and our outcomes at the end point. They can be about me, but most of the time they're about bigger picture, 30,000 foot level stakeholders. So the one side of the screen is about our immediate users, teachers, students, and parents. The other side is more about office administration and 30,000 foot level views. Another way to look at what the big picture is of assessment. Here's the interesting thing though, and the one thing that I hope you pay attention to and are really interested in. Rick Stiggins is one of my favorite people, and he does a lot of work on the relationship between the teacher and the student and what happens in the classroom. And he is a big leader in formative assessment and has been for years. And he has done some amazing work on that relationship. And it's really interesting to me because he says the one person that we always seem to forget about in the assessment process is the student. And we really want students to own their own learning and to have, because what happens to them, those results do in a way influence and affect their own learning. So in the state of Oregon, they've actually written it into law. And I thought it was kind of interesting to see, what does the law say in Oregon about students' rights in regard to their own assessment? So there is a Bill of Assessment Rights. There is the statute there if you're ever interested in taking a look at it. And it says students are entitled to understand these things: the purpose for the assessment. You know, what are these results going to be used for? Is it for me in the classroom? Is it for somebody else? How is this going to work? What the learning targets are that are in the assessment, and so that they know how to meet them, and what the scoring guides are for those, so kids know what the attainment is supposed to be, and the differences between good and poor performance on pending assessments so that kids can learn to self-assess. So look at what they have done in the state of Oregon. They have made assessment all about the learner. They've also added that students are entitled to dependable assessment of their achievement and effective communication of results, but those rely on things outside the student. And as great as they are, that's not my focus for today, because my focus is on this piece of assessment and how that's going to work in the classroom. But I did think you would find that pretty interesting that one of our states actually has it written into law, what students need to understand and are entitled to understand about their own assessment. And it's here too, because from a motivational perspective, it's important to remember that the end result is that students make decisions about themselves based on their interpretation of their assessment results. And those decisions have real consequences. So if students don't think they can meet the goals and they don't think they can do it, oftentimes they'll give up. So it's really important to know that assessment has a direct impact on motivation. So we have to be really careful about how we use results in our classroom. So before we get to talking about formative assessment in particular, let's talk about some possible assessment methods. And I stole this idea and these particular pictures from my colleague, Dr. Jean Kearns. And we talk about this all the time in our world. Assessment generally falls into 4 categories. Selected response, which includes things that we're really familiar with: multiple choice, true, false, matching, fill-in. These are really incredibly efficient kinds of ways to get information back about what students know and don't know. There's also things that fall into extended written responses, where students are writing essays, or they're writing arguments, or they're doing all kinds of things that show that they know something. There's performance assessments where kids have to do different things. These are longer, they're more in depth. They give you a lot more information back at a much deeper level, but boy, do they take a long time to do. So we don't do them as often as we do selected response, just because one is more efficient than the other. And if we're about efficiency, we're going to use one and not the other. The last category is personal communication. Questions, conversations that we have with kids, conferences, interviews, ways to get information pulled out to see what kids know. And it's really interesting, and Jean compares it to the tools. And you're going to use whatever tool you need to get the information back that you want. So I'm going to use a jackhammer if I want to dig up a sidewalk. And I'm certainly not going to use my regular hammer there to do that, because the jackhammer does a much more efficient job for that particular purpose. And I'm certainly not going to use my tiny tack hammer, because that's really good for fine detail hammering. I might use that if I am recovering something and putting tacks in the back of a chair. I might use my regular hammer when I'm building something, but that jackhammer I'm going to use when I'm digging up that sidewalk. The sledgehammer I'm going to use to knock things down. So all the same tool, a hammer, but all different kinds of hammers to get all the different possible methods that we need to get the job done. So that's one kind of good example about it. But here's the thing about all of that. There are rules of engagement with our hammers, right? Assessment methods are not interchangeable. They work differently, well, and in different contexts. So you got to think about this. You don't get to have a favorite. You really don't get to have a favorite that you turn to every single time if it can't accurately measure the learning target that you have. So you can't get attached to anything. Multiple choice is not always the best method, even though all high stakes tests rely on that. And assessment literacy is knowing when and to apply the strengths of each assessment method to your learning target. None of these is inherently superior to the others. We need them all. We need a collage. We need a variety of ways to get the information we need to truly know if a child knows something or not. So let's go back again and look at another example of how that works. And true, each method brings specific strengths and weaknesses to each situation. So you have to know that and know which one to use where, and know that sometimes there are strengths and weaknesses that go to each one. So think about it if you're a sculptor. Let's give you another example. Sculptors use all different kinds of tools to create amazingly beautiful things. And if you see at the left-hand side there, they're starting out with that really big block of granite. Who knows what that's going to turn out to be? But they use those big heavy tools at the beginning, and then check it out on the other side when they're working on the details to hammer out what that final sculpted piece is going to be. They use a different set of tools. So all different kinds of tools that they need to create a final product. All different kinds of assessment tools to create a collage that gives you a much truer picture of kids and how much they really know. So let's take a look at one of my favorite guys on the planet. If you are into formative assessment at all, if you're into really getting a deeper understanding of the relationship between teachers and students and how that works in a classroom, you need to read the work by Dylan William. He's authored lots of articles, lots of books, and he really became famous years ago when he was a college professor for this article that he wrote called Inside the Black Box. And inside the black box, he was looking at the relationship between teachers and students and what happens in the classroom and how that relationship affects what they're learning. Well, let me show you what he found out, because I think it's kind of cool. He found out, and he did this along with a guy named Paul Black. He didn't do this study on his own, just so you know. That's why there's two names up there. Students, this is really, really important. Students taught by teachers who integrated assessment with instruction could achieve in 6 or 7 months what otherwise would take a year. So think about that. If I'm really good as a teacher at integrating assessment with learning and what's going on in that classroom, and I can get everything done in 6 or 7 months, all the stuff I've got to do, that leaves me months, let's say 6 months, that leaves me months 7, 8, and 9, possibly 10, depending on how long I'm in school, to get all kinds of time back to do all kinds of other meaningful things to continue to move kids forward. So it's really, really important to note that 6 or 7 months, what it would take one teacher next door to do a year, it takes me 6 or 7 months. I have all kinds of time to add even more to really accelerate learning for the kids in my classroom. And it's interesting to note that it didn't matter. More importantly, these are consistent across all countries in the world and for across all ages and all subjects. Doesn't matter. What matters is how good the teacher is at integrating assessment and instruction. So think it might be important? Are you starting to think that maybe it has room, but you're not quite sure? So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So from a research perspective, for all my nerdy data geeks like me out there, they said that there were effect sizes of 1/2 to a full standard deviation. If you are not a statistics person, you're like, so what? You lost me, Julie. All right, well, let's talk about what that looks like in layman's terms for the rest of us. So an effect size of 1/2 to 1% is going to look like this. See that bell curve at the top? If 50%, the line right in the middle. If I have an effect size of 1/2 to 1, 1/2 to 1 standard deviation, 1 standard deviation is more than 30 percentile points. So if I have a child who's scoring at the 50th percentile and I'm a master at integrating assessment and instruction, I could have the potential to increase that child's learning by 30 percentile points, between 15 and 30. Huge gains. So from 65 to 80, huge gains. Or if I look at it at grade equivalence, I have a 4th grader, and if I have an effect size of 1/2 to 1, 1/2 is going to give me 1 grade level equivalent higher. 1 effect size is going to give me 2 grade equivalent higher. Or if I'm a high school person and I don't care about these things, but I do care about how my kids perform on the SAT test, I can increase their score by 100 points on the SAT. So you tell me, does that matter? Does formative assessment matter? Is it going to make a difference in the classroom? I think so. The impact of quality formative assessment in the classroom is so huge. So it's something we probably need to pay attention to. So let me help you pay attention to it. I'm a practitioner too by trade. I love research, but if I can't find a way to see how it fits into practice, I don't really care about it all that much. And so there is a guy, Dylan William, you know he's my favorite by now. He's written lots of books, but here's one of my favorite practitioner books. It is called Embedded Formative Assessment. I have my own copy right here and I highly recommend it. Great book. And he's going to talk about, and I'm going to share with you just a few, 75 strategies in 5 different areas of formative assessment that can make a huge difference in your classroom. He also has an earlier version. Either one of these are great. His earlier version, his first edition, Embedded Formative Assessment, just like the second one, only has 53 areas, 53 strategies in those 5 areas. So you can decide, you can choose, or you can be really nerdy, someone like me who really cares about data, and you can have them both. So the strategies I'm going to give you today actually come directly from his book. So let's take a look at some of those. So we're going to go through each area and hopefully I can give you some good practical strategies that you can learn. So if you've got your note page, on your note page you have the research section. So I hope you took down a few notes about things that were important to you about research. And now I have space for one each of those 5 areas so that if you find a technique that you want to try, you can just jot it down on your paper and take that with you and try it out in your classroom. So here are the 5 assessment areas for learning strategies. So assessment for learning is our formative piece. It's that dynamic that you have as a teacher with your students when you're teaching. So here are the 5. And this first one, clarifying and sharing learning intentions and criteria for success, is really vital and important because it helps students understand what the end goal is for learning. So you've got to make your intentions clear in language that your kids can understand no matter what age that may be, and they have to know what the criteria are in order to get there. What does it mean for me to be successful at this? What is that going to look like to me? So very important that kids can clarify and share learning intentions and criteria for success, that you as a teacher take a moment every time before you're starting something new to review these with your kids before you begin. So there's a couple practical strategies for this. And some of these you may like, and some of these you may not like. If you don't like any of them, guess what? There's a lot more in his book. And if you're really interested, I recommend you buy the book and find strategies that work for you. Some of these are the things that I have tried in the past and have worked really well for me. Some of these apply more to older kids and some to younger kids. Tried to find the balance for you. So the first one here is model papers. So let's say you've given your kids in your classroom, you're a middle school teacher or your high school teacher, and you're having them write a paper. So your assignment was to have them write a paper, to bring that paper back to class and turn them in. You're going to collect them the next day, and then you're going to give students their paper. You're going to collect their papers. The next day, you're going to give the students their papers back their own paper back, and you're going to give them 3 samples from all the papers you collected the day before that you felt were the best essays in the class for a particular skill that you're focusing on in that paper. So kids aren't having to look at these 3 sample papers in their paper and say, wow, I have to write them all exactly like this. They're going to look at one aspect of that paper. So you're going to ask the students to read the 3 papers that you gave them before they come to class the next day. During the next lesson that following day, you want to talk to the students about the important features in those 3 essays and have them talk about what they saw, what the elements were that made those 3 good. And you're going to have a classroom discussion about it. You're going to go round and round with it, and you're going to invite all the students then at the end of that, including those 3 whose essays were judged as good, because remember, they still have 2 others too to look at, and you're going to have them redraft, rewrite, and resubmit their essays. Why does this work? Because that could be a little scary because they're looking at other kids' work. Why does it work? Because it exemplifies what we call excellent work in a really concrete way. And guess who's doing the work? The students are, not you as the teacher. You've already done it when you chose the 3. You know what your target is. You know what you want kids to get better at. But the students then had to do the work to compare their writing to the models of the writing and then give feedback that is much more engaging than when they're talking about it the next day. You can get in trouble with this one though, if you're not careful. So you have to make sure that students have, or students believe, and you have an atmosphere of trust in your classroom where students believe that the model papers are written within their own ability to achieve that kind of writing. So you have to really think about your classroom and your kids and whether or not they believe they can meet the criteria that the other 3 great essays contained. If they don't feel that way, it's not going to work. And if you only have 1 model, you have to be careful. You always want more than 1, because if it's 1 model, students try then to emulate that one because they think that's the perfect example. And we don't want to do that because we don't want them copying that example. We want them to use those ideas and make their own writing better. So it's kind of interesting. You just have to keep focused, and you have to have an atmosphere of trust so that kids believe that model papers are going to help them get better. I also like this one, What Not to Write. How many of you have seen the show, What Not to Wear? The show, What Not to Wear, for those of you that haven't seen it, is a show where they choose a person who really is struggling with dressing themselves in a way that flatters them or makes them look better and feel better. And they have the person that they choose come onto the show, and the person puts on their favorite outfit, and they get in front of all these mirrors, and they talk about why they like this outfit and what that outfit does for them. And then the hosts come in and say, well, let's re-look at this a little bit. And then let's talk about why this doesn't work. And let me show you different models of things that could work to bring out the positive things in your work or the positive things in your clothes. So the same thing applies here when we're looking at kids and having them work at models and see how things work. And what I like about this is that what we want them to do is look at others' work and each other's work, because sometimes it's easier to spot the error in someone else's work than it is in your own. I mean, think about this when we're doing things. I always have someone else edit my papers when I write them, because there are things that I miss because in my head, it sounds perfect. But when someone else reads it, then they go, hey, Julie, I don't know about this, or I don't know about this, or did you think about that? And so having somebody else take a look at my work brings up things that I just can't see. And then when I go back and write and I rewrite, I can take their suggestions and I can change things and make it better. And I wouldn't spot it on my own. I also think it's really good to have correct examples and incorrect examples, because you can't just show kids all the time. So I why I like What Not to Write, because if you're always showing them really good examples, sometimes that's really hard, and they need to see what's good and what's not so they can figure out how to make it better. I also like Choose, Swap, Choose. This is the 3rd activity here. This is great for my younger ones. So if you're repeating things. So for example, when you're teaching kids how to do cursive writing, you might have kids, or even in kids in primary when they're practicing writing the letter D. Let's go way down to primary, not even cursive writing. You might have your 1st graders and your kindergartners write 10 letter Ds in a row, small letter Ds. And then after they write, you've taught them how to do it, you've showed them what to do, you've had them go through a little practice, and then they write 10 on their own. And after they write their 10 on their own, they're supposed to go back and evaluate each one of those 10. And they're supposed to choose the one that they think is the best and circle it. And then what you want your little ones to do is you want them to swap with somebody else. And they're going to switch papers. And then that same student is going to look at the persons that they swapped with, and they're going to see all of their letter Ds too. And then they're going to circle the one that they think is the best. If it is the same, they're going to talk about why they both agreed that that one was the best. And if it's different, they're going to share why they thought another one was better than the one that the student circled. So it's really nice because it helps them start to articulate elements of what they think a good letter D should look like and why they chose one over another. So there's a little bit of self-assessment in there. There's a little bit of looking at someone else's work and not my own and finding the errors in there. And then a little bit of strategy of talking about why you thought this one was better than that one. So all of that's good for kids. So last one is one of my favorite. It's called Walt, Wilf, and Tib. It sounds a little bit like story characters from a book. So this is geared toward more of my primary grades and my younger kids. But Walt is, what are we learning today? So what are we learning today is Walt. We are learning to write sentences today. Wilf, what I am looking for. So what I am looking for is a capital letter at the beginning, a subject, a verb, and I don't know, a subject and a verb and a sentence that ends with a stop sign. And maybe I want finger spaces between the words too, depending on what age group you're working with. And this is because TIB, this is because it makes it easier for others to read your thoughts when you are doing these things. So Walt, Wilf, and Tib. I've seen Walt turned into visuals where there's an ice cream cone with one scoop at the bottom. That's Walt. Wilf is the middle scoop, and then Tib is the top one so that other peoples can read your thoughts. This I saw work really well in a kindergarten classroom when my son was in kindergarten, and he gave himself a 2-scooper because he forgot to put his stop sign at the end of his sentence. Or another time he gave himself a 2-scooper because he had a beginning with a capital letter. He had a person and that person doing something, but he didn't have finger spaces between his words, but he did have his stop sign at the end. So, you know, it was a really great way for even very young children to practically participate and understand how to make their work better. So that was clarifying learning and sharing learning intentions and the criteria for success. So 4 great strategies. The book has plenty more. If you're really interested in finding out more, I highly encourage you to do so. This next section is engineering effective classroom discussions, questions, and learning tasks. I can't go over all 3 of these, so I had to pick and choose. So I chose today to talk about questions because questioning is such a key area in any classroom because as teachers, we're asking questions all day long. So we're only going to focus on questioning today, and in particular, one of my favorite strategies. So one of my favorite strategies is this thing that Dylan William calls a hinge point question. Okay, so a hinge point question is a question that we ask as teachers all the time at a particular point in the lesson when we're trying to decide, did kids get it or not? Can I move on or do I stay? All right. And so what he says is we do this all the time, but we're not focused on it enough. And we don't come up with contingency plans for what to do when we don't get the answer that we think we should get. So oftentimes we ask really good questions, we check for understanding, but when we look out at the sea of kids in front of us and we're checking for understanding, we sometimes just go ahead anyway because we don't know what to do and we haven't planned for what happens if they don't get it. What are some things that I should be doing based on the response of my students? Not if they get it, because I know I'm going to go on anyway, but what am I going to do if they don't get it, or I'm not sure enough of them have gotten it to move on? So Dylan says, teachers, we have to plan for that. And what we have to plan for, what we need to think about is this. What do I do? Well, look at the very bottom. If most of my kids have it, and I can tell by their whiteboard holding up something or whatever they're doing to show me that they know something, if more than 85% have it, I can probably move on and keep going. I know who doesn't have it and I need to keep an eye on that, but I can move on. Well, what if I do if it's about half and half? but it's not up to 85%. Maybe it's a little more than that, but it's not there. Well, you have to plan for that. And Dylan Williams says, this is the best time to stop and do peer instruction, because if 50% have them and 50% don't, they can pair up. They can teach each other. And oftentimes kids do better and learn more with peer instruction. So those that have it can explain it to those that don't. And if you're not quite sure if the pair up is going to work, so have them pair up twice. They can share with each other twice, and then you can get that up to par before you move on. And then if it's below 50%, I have to reteach. Well, here's the thing, teachers, have we planned for reteaching if they don't get it? If we haven't, we tend to just go on anyway, and we'll think, oh, we'll get those kids at the end and we'll do another little group lesson and I'll reteach it and I'll do it again. No, what he says is you got to do it right then, and you have to have a plan in place, ready to go to reteach. So something to really think about, because when these hinge point questions come up, we can ask great questions, but if we don't have a plan in place, we don't do anything about it. We just move forward. So we have to have a plan in place for what we're going to do to reteach if kids aren't getting the learning target that we're after. So it's a really critical juncture, that question. So if you're a fan of questions, there's so many wonderful books out there about effective question strategies, effective questions to use in different situations. And I can give you some of those resources if you're interested in that. All you have to do is let me know, because I think it's so valuable and key. Here's some other great questioning strategies that I've used. All right. Pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. So here's the thing with teachers, we don't like silence. But this one's going to force us to do that. Pose a question to your class. Pause. Count backward. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wait a little more. Pounce. Choose a student. Don't let anybody raise their hand. Choose a student and say, Jessica, what do you think the answer is? And tell me about it. And then as soon as Jessica's done that, you don't move on, you bounce to someone else and you say, Tom, tell me what Jessica just said and what you think about that. And then you do that a couple times. Pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. Pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. Keeps everybody engaged because they don't know who you're going to call on. And it keeps everyone thinking, because just because Jessica answered the first question doesn't mean that the teacher isn't going to come around and ask someone else to paraphrase what she just said and then to add more to it to tell them what they think about that question. Here's what you have to do, and that's the card on the very end. Adopt a no hands up policy if you're going to have great questioning strategies to really keep kids engaged in the learning process. It's so scary to adopt a no hands up policy because you are relying on your ability to keep everyone engaged with really great questioning techniques and strategies. But what a no hands policy does is it really forces everyone to be engaged. So I highly recommend you give it a shot if you do it. So pose, pause, pounce, and bounce is a way to do that. Popsicle sticks in a jar. This is really common now. I love popsicle sticks in a jar because you pull one out and that's the person who has to answer the question. You put it back in because you never know, you might get your name pulled out again. So everybody has to stay focused. Everybody has to pay attention. My other one is think, pair, share. I did think, pair, and share all the time in the classroom when I was a teacher. But what I didn't do, and I would go back and do now based on all the research that I know about this, is I would do think, pair, and share what your partner said, not what you said. Because then students really have to pay attention to the think, pair, share part, because when I call on that pair, I'm going to say, Tommy, tell me what Ginger said, and Ginger, tell me what Tommy said. So they're not going to, they have to paraphrase what somebody else said about it, not what they said, which really forces them to stay engaged and learning about the content. Again, some of my favorite questioning strategies, you can find your own. And I'm sure some of you have used many of these that have worked. The next one that is also one of my favorites is, let's see here, if it'll, providing feedback that moves learners forward. So we all provide a lot of feedback. Feedback's common. We do feedback in the classroom all the time, but providing feedback that really moves kids forward is something totally different. So there's a couple studies. I'm going to go over these really, really quickly because we're going to run out of time if I don't. They had kids in Israel, 264 low and high ability grade 6 students in 12 classes across 4 students. And they analyzed 132 students at the top of the class and the bottom of the class. So my AB kids and my CDF kids. Same teaching, Same aims and goals, same teachers, same classwork, but the teachers gave different kinds of feedback. They gave scores, they gave comments, and they gave scores plus comments. Normally we'd say, what do you think? Who scored the highest? We don't have time for that today, so we're going to say feedback. If they gave scores, they didn't make any gains. Not that they didn't learn, but they didn't make any above and beyond moving forward, accelerating learning gains. The top of the kids really liked it because they know what their scores are. They already know they're successful. The bottom kids hated it because they already know what they're going to get on that one. The next one was comments. There was a 30% higher than average gain for that. Everybody liked the comments. Everybody liked them. Made everybody feel positive. Notice there's no score. They're just comments on their papers. The last group had both. Guess what? No gains if you have both. You know why? Scores trump comments every time because kids are conditioned to believe that it's the score that matters most, not the comments. So if you really want to encourage learning and move learning forward, make sure that you have just comments on kids' work. Here's another one. 200 kids, grade 5 and 6, still again, the studies in Israel, don't know why they're doing all those great studies. They gave them divergent thinking tasks and they four matched groups. The experimental group just had comments. Group 2 just had grades. Group 3 got praise. And group 4, nothing, no feedback at all. Who wins? You got it. Those that had descriptive comments on their work, because descriptive comments move learning forward. There's something motivational about them. It describes the things that they did well and things that they need to work on, and that's what makes the difference. No grade attached, no anything. Oh, this is where I'm at. This is what I need to do to get better. They clearly wrote it out. I can do that. And kids can then keep motivated and move on. Burkhardt says, and she's another famous assessment researcher, the grade trumps the comment every time. The student will read the comment that the teacher intended to be descriptive as an explanation for the A, B, or C grade. Descriptive comments alone have the best chance of being read as descriptive if you don't accompany them with a grade. Something to think about. Maybe we don't need to have nearly as many grades as we think we do. All right, feedback matters. Activating students as owners of their own learning. Key thing, we need kids to be involved in the process, to learn to self-assess where they are and where they're at, and they do it all the time anyway. So let's help them to do it in the right way because it's motivational, right? Each student has a role. Here's what they're asking themselves all the time. Where am I going? Where am I now? How do I close the gap to get there? When kids become disenfranchised with school, this is why they become disenfranchised with school, because they say, I go every day, but I have no clue what's going on in the school. I have no clue what they want me to do. I have no idea where I'm going. So therefore, I'm not going to engage anymore. So other kids come and they say, okay, I get where I'm going. I understand where they want me to go, but I have no idea how to get there because I don't have any clue where I am right now. I have no way to close the gap. And so since I can't close the gap, I keep coming every day. I keep understanding where they want me to go. I just have no strategies to get myself there. So we need to help kids get themselves there. And I highly recommend you put this chart up in your classroom so that you can help kids focus on the student as the most influential decision maker in your classroom. Where am I going? They have to understand the learning targets, and you have to use examples of strong and weak work. We talked about that already. This is from a different researcher. This is from Jan Shapui, who she did her work based on the Australian professor Royce Sadler, who has done lots of work on this particular piece right here. Where am I now? You got to give kids descriptive feedback, and you have to teach students to self-assess their work. You can do that by having them work at others' work and then talk about their own, and to teach them how to set goals so they can get those increments to get there to close the gap. Focus your lessons, one learning target or one quality at a time. We think we can multitask, but brain and research and cognitive science proves that we really aren't very good at that. And it's much better if we can do one thing at a time. Teach students to revise focused. Don't have them revise an entire paper, have them revise the beginning, have them revise the connecting sentences between paragraphs, whatever it is that you need them to do. Have them focus on one thing in that particular paper. It gets too overwhelming if they're trying to do all things all at once. And then help by the last one, engaging students in self-reflection and having them keep track of and share their learning with others, the stakeholders that are important to them, you, their parents, the people that are closest to them. All right, another one, a partner in the assessment. If it's done with students rather than to students, they will be able to watch themselves grow over time, take corrective action, and maintain a sense of control over their success, which is the goal, right? The goal is to help them maintain control, help them know where they're going to fill the gap so that they can stay engaged and part of school. A couple other things that you can do to do that. I put two things up here, colored cups. I like colored cups because it helps kids show that they understand without having to raise their hand. And if you adopt a no hands policy, you need another way to know if kids are with you. So you get a stack of 3. When the teacher starts the lesson, everybody should be on green. You can have them flip it to yellow. Teachers get to decide how they want it to work. But if the teacher's moving too fast, the kids can say it's yellow. You got to slow down a little bit, and then the teacher can slow down and give more examples if she sees a lot of yellow cups. A red cup means I've got to ask a question, and teachers can stop and then they can answer some of the questions at points that they think it's helpful or as soon as they see them. I've also seen teachers say, okay, here's the red cup, the student will ask a question and then she'll pull another student up to answer the question just to make sure kids are staying engaged throughout the lesson, because we need kids to be engaged and we need them to be responsive. So the more engaged they are, the more responsive they are. And if they have to participate, because you never know if the teacher is going to call you up to answer the question that was asked, if your cup is still green, you got to be ready to go and you got to be paying attention. The other thing that I love and that I did all the time was what I called learning portfolios as a teacher, or I called them working portfolios. Dylan William in his book calls them learning portfolios, but it's really putting work in a portfolio that shows how kids are growing and moving closer to a target that you set, or getting better at doing something. It isn't a final product like you would see in an artist portfolio where they have the best examples of their work. It's a learning portfolio. Maybe in kindergarten it was when the beginning of the year when the teacher started teaching kids about how to write sentences. And they have a sample from the beginning of the year, maybe in the middle of the year, maybe again at the end of the year, so you can see how kids have grown and changed over time. They're learning, or what I called working portfolios. I loved them when I was a multi-age teacher because I had years of work on kids and you could really see progress and growth then. The very last area of study today, activating students as instructional resources for one another. Truly important. We really want students to see that they can help each other and that they can be instructional resources for each other when things get tough. A couple of quick strategies for that. C3 before me. One of my favorite ones used all the time when I was a teacher, and here's why. Because you know how you have those days where you teach the lesson, you're doing all the things right in between the lesson, and you get kids started on their work, and all of a sudden you have like 10 kids who are right there trying to ask you a question about something. And so I'm like, oh no, this isn't going to work for me. So I would make them, we just had all kinds of scratch paper around, and they would have to have kids' initials. They'd have to have 3 sets of initials on a piece of scrap paper before they could come and ask me their question. Because if they talked to 3 other people and they couldn't get their question answered, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on that I needed to pay attention to. And then it helps them see each other as partners in this learning process, that if they have a question, they can ask them too. Another one is 2 stars and a wish. And I really like this when you're teaching kids how to evaluate each other and to look at each other's work. So that kids stay focused. So 2 stars, 2 great things you saw in the piece of work that you're looking at, and 1 wish that you would have for them. Maybe it's, wow, I really love, if they're teaching kids about writing paragraphs, wow, I really love your opening sentence. You did a great job on your closing sentence, but I really wish your 2 sentences in the middle had more to do with whatever, however you want to do it. I also like end of topic questions. Because I think that's kind of a cool thing. You do this at the end. So you say, okay, are there any questions? And so you know how we do that? I'm guilty of having done that. You say, all right, at the end in your table group, the people you're sitting with today, I want you guys to talk and I want you to decide if you have any questions. So even if you think you don't, you need to talk until you find a really good question. And I want you to write it down on this piece of paper. As the teacher, you collect those. You kind of sort them based on the questions that kids have, and then you quickly address them before they get started on their own. It's kind of what you do before you get to C3 before me. And it helps make sure that kids understand the concepts, that you've covered any misconceptions. If there's any crazy question out there, you can deal with it before they get started. Great way to help teachers make connections on different issues that kids might have and literacy skills that they need to write before they get together and get more things going. So tell me, we're getting close to the end. The impact of quality formative classroom assessment is huge. You can do more in 6 and 7 months, and you can then it gives you that 3 or 4 extra months of the school year to continue to learn and grow and accelerating kids' learning just by the quality formative assessment and that relationship you have with the kids in your classroom. So this was a really short overview of how formative assessment can make a positive difference in your classroom and some practical strategies to get there. I want to end with a couple big ideas I want you to think about and then encourage each and every one of you to try these strategies in your practice. Pick a few, try them out, because the evidence clearly shows that these things make a difference in learning for all kids. Important that you have these 3 things in place, so think about it. You need to have a community of respect in your classroom. Some of these examples and the strategies I shared with you won't work if you do not. 2, you need to have an atmosphere of teaching and learning is continually getting better, not as a competitive atmosphere of I'm better than you because I got a better grade than you. So how you set that up and that atmosphere of continuous learning versus competition is going to be key. Finally, clear learning targets all the time so that your kids can continue to learn and grow. I thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to learning and working with you as we continue to grow together and learn more about assessment every single day. Here is my contact information. If you need anything at any time, I am here for you. So thank you all for your time, your effort, your energy today. I wish you nothing but the best as you continue to learn and grow. Thank you.